Silent Hill 2 is the second installment in the Silent Hill survival horror series, and the first game of the series to be released for PlayStation 2. The game was developed by Team Silent and published by Konami. It launched in North America on September 25th, 2001. A more definitive version of the game, Silent Hill 2 Restless Dreams, was re-released with new features on the PS2 as a greatest hits title and ported to the Xbox and PC. It is known as Silent Hill 2 Saigo no Uda, the final song in Japan, and in Europe, Silent Hill 2 Interferes on Xbox, and Silent Hill 2 Director's Cut on PlayStation 2 and PC. It features an additional UFO ending, a new scenario called Born from a Wish, better graphics and lighting effects, and exclusive to the PC version, the ability to save anywhere, swap weapons without opening the menu, and a movie gallery. It was later re-released in high-definition resolution with optional new voices, along with Silent Hill 3, for the Silent Hill HD Collection on Xbox 360 and PS3. But the HD Collection is notoriously, well, we don't talk about that. A remake was announced to be in development by Bloober Team on October 19, 2022, during the Silent Hill Transmission event. It was released on October 8, 2024, for PlayStation 5 and PC. A film version which adapts the story for the game, Return to Silent Hill, is being developed by the director of the first film, Silent Hill, Christoph Gans. We'll talk about the remake a little bit later. But for now, let's start with the original. James Sunderland has arrived in the town of Silent Hill, Maine, after receiving a letter from his wife, Mary, despite the fact that she suffered from a terminal disease and died 3 years prior. The letter claims that Mary is waiting for James in their special place, which confuses James, as the whole town of Silent Hill was their special place. Despite James wondering if the letter is a prank by someone with a twisted sense of humor, he notes that the letter is definitely written in her handwriting, and the author is aware James once made a promise to return to Silent Hill with Mary, and that he never fulfilled said promise. After leaving the town's observation deck and walking to Silent Hill, James enters a graveyard and meets Angela Orozco, a nervous young woman who came to the town to search for her missing mother. She warns him that there's something wrong with the town, and that it could be dangerous, but he ignores her warnings, saying he doesn't care if it's dangerous and that he plans on finding his missing someone too. When James reaches Silent Hill, he discovers that it is not the same beautiful town it was a few years ago. In addition to the bizarre, omnipresent fog, the whole town seems to be rotting away and abandoned. Macabre, vaguely humanoid creatures are roaming the streets and attempting to attack James whenever possible. When he discovers that the path to his first destination, the Lakeside Rosewater Park, is blocked, James decides to pass through an apartment complex to reach what he believes could be the special place Mary mentioned in her letter. Inside the apartments, James briefly encounters a little girl, who steps on his hand before running away. Soon after that, he finds Pyramid Head, a humanoid monster whose head is completely obscured by a giant metal pyramid-shaped helmet. James later meets a young man, Eddie Dombrowski, who is vomiting into one of the apartment toilets. Eddie defensively responds to questions regarding a corpse in the refrigerator of the apartment room. In another apartment complex, James finds Angela again lying in front of a large mirror, contemplating suicide with a knife in her hand. Trying to talk her out of it, James persuades her to hand him the knife for her own safety, and she flees in an unusual panic to resume her search for her mother. After James leaves the apartment building, he finds the girl he previously met humming to herself on a graffiti-covered wall. He confronts her in frustration, and she reveals to James that she knows Mary and that he never loved her anyway, but then jumps off the other side of the wall before James can get more information from her. When James finally reaches Rosewater Park, he meets a woman named Maria, who appears nearly identical to his recently deceased wife Mary, but showing off more skin and possessing more of an arrogant attitude. During their time together, Maria reveals insight into matters that only he or Mary would know, and acts in a very seductive manner towards James. Maria accompanies James in his attempt to reach his second suspected special place, the Lakeview Hotel that he and Mary once stayed at. James enters Pete's Bolorama, where he meets Eddie again. He also spots the little girl who runs away from James upon seeing him. Eddie then reveals to James that her name is Laura. Outside, Maria claims to have seen Laura, and out of concern for her, has James try to pursue her. After passing through Heaven's Night, James and Maria see Laura enter Brookhaven Hospital, so they follow. While exploring the hospital, Maria becomes sick and rests in a hospital room. James finds Laura in one of the rooms, but he becomes angry at her for claiming to have known Mary for the past year, in clear contradiction to his belief that she has been dead for 3 years. Laura responds by locking him in a room filled with covered monsters stuffed in hanging cages, under the pretense of looking for a letter from his wife. After they are defeated, the hospital undergoes a sudden dramatic change to the other world, where James returns to the hospital room to find Maria missing. James later finds Maria in the hospital's basement. However, Maria becomes incensed, claiming that James had abandoned her, and that he doesn't seem to care to see that she's alive after presumably dying. After she calms down, they continue to search for Laura. Pyramid Head appears and chases both James and Maria through the hospital's basement, and the creature manages to slaughter Maria while they attempt to make their escape via an elevator. Alone again and saddened by the loss of Maria, James decides to refocus on his original task of finding Mary. He leaves the hospital and finds a key buried beneath a statue in Rosewater Park, which leads him to the Historical Society. The Historical Society becomes an exploration of 2 levels, Toluca Prison and a labyrinth in which Pyramid Head resides. In this area, James finds Maria, miraculously alive and locked in a prison cell, who greets him with memories of Mary. Maria claims that they were simply separated in the hospital basement, and that she had not been killed. James tells her that he will free her, but upon reaching the other side of the cell, he discovers that she had been mysteriously murdered. From a newspaper article, James discovers that Angela killed her father, who sexually and physically abused her under the complicity of her mother. James saves her from a monstrous representation of her father, after which she becomes hostile. Angela expresses her distrust in James and men in general, as from her experience they were only after one thing. She also calls James a liar who didn't want Mary around anymore before leaving. Near the end of the labyrinth, James finds Eddie, who was mentally snapped after a life of bullying and verbal abuse by his peers due to his physical appearance and him being overweight. Eddie reveals he killed the dog of a bullying football player and then shot the dog's owner in the leg. It becomes clear that Eddie is mentally unwell and is willing to kill the next one to laugh at him. James unwisely asks Eddie if he's gone nuts, prompting a battle between James and Eddie. James kills Eddie in self-defense, and he feels shocked and ashamed of himself to have killed a human. James questions his perception of the events linked to his arrival in the town. As well, the letter that he has supposedly received from Mary becomes blank, indicating that the letter itself was something that never actually existed. James exits the labyrinth and rows a boat to the Lakeview Hotel, in hopes of finding Mary. In the hotel restaurant, James finds Laura, and she gives him the letter she claimed to be seeking earlier, which reveals that Mary wanted to adopt her and confirms her claims of knowing Mary for the past year. In room 312, he watches a videotape he apparently left at the hotel 3 years ago, which shows that he killed Mary by smothering her. For a few moments, he silently sits, realizing the truth and facing his own psychological guilt. Laura, ready to leave the town, finds James, and he chooses to reveal the truth to her. Laura is furious at him for killing Mary and screams she hates him, before exiting the room without another word. The radio James has been carrying to warn him of the approach of monsters then sends a message from Mary asking him to find her. James explores the rest of the hotel, discovering that it is decrepit and rotting, and is now nothing more than the remains of a building that has experienced a fire. James then finds Angela on a burning staircase, vacantly standing between 2 skinned, blood-stained male corpses, stitched to a frame, symbolic of her dead father and brother. Angela asks him to return her knife so that she can end her life, but James does not comply. As Angela ascends the burning staircase, James states that the room is hot as hell, to which she replies, "For me, it's always like this." Angela disappears beyond the flames, presumably killing herself off-screen. In the hotel lobby, James finds Maria resurrected again, bound and screaming for his help, but she is immediately killed by 2 pyramid heads. James then realizes that they have been created to punish him for his sins, and proceeds to fight the duo. After they have sufficiently been weakened, they impale themselves with their own spears, as if to indicate that their purpose has been fulfilled. James is led to a hallway, where he listens to a previous interaction that Mary and he had, while she was still alive. In the situation, James had brought Mary flowers, but she refused them, yelling in exasperation at James, stating that she was too disgusting to deserve flowers. By the end of the conversation, Mary desperately pleads for James to be with her. The memory ends, and James then enters a large metallic complex with a long staircase. At the top of the staircase on the roof, he finds a woman resembling Mary, who transforms into a monster after becoming angered by him. Upon defeating this final demon, the game comes to a close. Silent Hill 2 does not have an explicit canonical ending. A translation of the Book of Lost Memories says, of the 4 conclusions, there is no one correct interpretation. Each ending indicates a different possibility. Leave. James reaches the hotel rooftop and sees a woman whom he mistakes for his lost wife. Yet it is not Mary, but instead of vindictive Maria, who then makes a final attempt to get James to accept her. James rebuffs her, however, and she turns into a monster similar to the hanging monsters in the hospital, becoming the final boss. Upon her defeat, James is granted a final meeting with Mary, where he admits that he came to deeply resent her as constantly having to deal with her sickness, and her misplaced anger took over his life. Maria denies that is the reason he killed her and gives him her letter. James then leaves Silent Hill together with Laura and Water. The woman on the rooftop is Maria once again, making a final attempt to get James to accept her. James rebuffs her again, however, and she turns into the final boss. Upon her defeat, James is granted a final meeting with Mary, where he admits that he came to deeply resent her as constantly having to deal with her sickness, and her misplaced anger took over his life. But Mary insists that James has suffered enough and gives him the letter. She violently coughs and dies again as he holds her hand. According to the novelization, Mary's corpse was already in the trunk of his car. He takes out her body and arranges it in the passenger seat. Masahiro Ito and Gaichi state that she was actually in the back seat, rather than the trunk. James arrives at the conclusion that he is unable to live without her, realizing that he came to Silent Hill to commit suicide in a place of memories. James then drowns himself by driving into Toluca Lake with his wife's corpse so that they can be together in death. A view from under the lake with bubbles rising to the surface is seen. If the player spends a lot of time with Maria and protects her well from monsters, including from Pyramid Head in the hospital basement, the woman in the final boss room will identify as Mary, who has not forgiven James for killing her. She will then turn to the final boss, and after her defeat, James returns to Rosewater Park to stare at the water. Maria, inexplicably resurrected again, asks James if he killed Mary again. James says that wasn't Mary, implying he believes she was just a hallucination or manifestation. James leaves town with Maria. As they leave, however, Maria starts coughing, implying she is suffering from the same illness as Mary. The woman James confronts on the rooftop is once again Maria. James immediately declares that he's finished with her. Maria tries to change his mind, but he rebuffs her and she turns into a being similar to the hanging monsters in the hospital, becoming the final boss. After defeating her, James rows a boat with Mary's corpse to the Church of the Rebirth on Toluca Lake Island, where he intends to use relics collected throughout the game to resurrect Mary with the help of the old gods of Silent Hill. The outcome of this remains unknown. What about Born from a Wish? Prior to James's arrival in the town, Maria wakes up alone and frightened in Heaven's Night. After pondering to herself about what she should do, she eventually decides to try and find someone else in the town. She begins to wander through the streets of Silent Hill until she eventually enters the Baldwin Mansion, an area out of bounds in the main game. Here she meets the owner of the mansion, Ernest Baldwin, although she never actually sees him. All their conversations are shared between locked doors. Ernest speaks in a strange monotone and asks her to find the white liquid to help him bring back his dead daughter Amy. Maria helps him with this even though it may not work, stating, "I don't mind fighting for an impossible cause." During Maria's exploration of the mansion, she finds a teddy bear in Amy's room. Maria comments that Laura would love it, showing that she shares some of Mary's memories. After Mary retrieves the white liquid to Ernest, he reveals slightly more, telling her about a man named James. He warns Maria that James is bad and that he's looking for the you that isn't you. This seems to stir something in Maria, who begins to remember things about James. That he wasn't good to his wife while she was ill, and that he killed her, but he also recalls that underneath, James is a kind person. Maria then opens the door, but the room where Ernest's voice had been coming from is empty, implying that he had been a ghost. Disappointed, Maria leaves the Baldwin mansion and contemplates suicide, holding her revolver against her head, but refrains and tosses it over a wall. She decides to follow her fate and walks to Rosewater Park, hoping that James will accept her. Gameplay in Silent Hill 2 is almost identical to the first game, which includes exploring Silent Hill with a flashlight and radio, while defeating monsters and solving puzzles along the way. Many of the environments are dark, and the flashlight is often the only source of light. The radio James receives detects monsters when they are nearby, by emitting static and notifying the player of their presence. James will find many helpful items on his journey, and without collecting specific items, the player cannot progress through the game. If James takes too much damage from an enemy, he will die. The tank controls in the first game are optional in Silent Hill 2, and the player can choose their preferred control scheme. The controller vibration is used to indicate that James's heartbeat will vibrate on low health. It also vibrates when attacking and when being attacked. For the first time in the series, the player can now block, even with a weapon like the handgun. This is performed by holding square or shift, or whatever the run or walk button is. The player must not be in lock-on mode to do this, and they can only block when an enemy is about to strike, so blocking requires timing. When a monster appears, the player will have to make a choice on whether to fight or flee. Both options work well in different scenarios. For example, in a narrow hallway, the better option would be to fight, but in a large open area, the better option would be not to engage the enemy. Even if James flees from a foe, he is still vulnerable to attacks. However, if James turns his flashlight off and walks instead of runs, this is less likely to happen. Upon reaching Rosewater Park, Maria will accompany James. She will follow James and is unable to defend herself as she is without a weapon. It becomes James's responsibility to protect her. If Maria dies by taking too much damage from enemies or if James kills her, the game will lead to a game over screen. Even if Maria is very far from James when he opens the door, she will appear right next to him in the next area. Silent Hill 2 original soundtracks were released in Japan on October 3rd, 2001, by Konami. The album contains 30 musical tracks from the game, some in-game and some exclusive to the album, and are completely instrumental. The soundtrack was re-released in Europe as Silent Hill 2 original soundtrack the same year. The CD was packed in a jewel case inserted in a paper box with different cover art. The soundtrack of Born from a Wish was never officially released, but there have been attempts to extract it directly from the game. What about the development? The atmosphere of the game is for the most part similar to the first Silent Hill, including the abandoned and/or decomposing look of the town, and the persistent fog obscuring the streets, but it has been given a more psychological twist. One example of this is James's letter, which progressively disappears during the game, hinting, as Konami later confirmed, that the letter was not real and merely another part of James's hallucinations. The implication is that as James slowly began to understand what he had done, the illusions of the town began to disappear. This can also be the explanation for the transformation of the hotel, as when James enters it is mostly intact, but after he sees the videotape he finds, it reverts to its true form, a mostly burned out structure. Other acknowledged attempts to induce a psychological influence on the game include placing Mary's dress in the room where James discovers the flashlight, and modeling at least 2 corpses in the town after James. The monsters in the game, as well as being more humanoid in design than their counterparts in the preceding game, are acknowledged to have been, for the most part, designed as a reflection of James's own subconscious. At least one creature, the mannequin, is acknowledged to have been created with sexual suggestion in mind, a reflection of his carnal desires. Pyramid Head is acknowledged to have been based upon James seeing materials on the executioners of the town's fictional history, and is intended to be a punisher for him. 2 exceptions to the theme are the Abstract Daddy, a reflection of the subconscious memories of Angela, and the Creepers, which are also seen in the first game. Silent Hill 2 slightly strays away from the order and themes of occultism and religion, focusing more on human psychology instead. Although there are still hints and traces of it, there's a much lesser focus compared to the first game. James, Angela, and Eddie may be agnostic or atheist, because they don't mention any deities or religious context during the game, aside from James mentioning that the old gods haven't left this place, and the rebirth ending. Silent Hill 2 also references real-life events. The creators have said that the name Mary came from Mary Ann Nichols and Mary Jane Kelly, Jack the Ripper's first and last victims respectively. Other observers have claimed that Maria's outfit was copied from Christina Aguilera's appearance at the 1999 Teen Choice Awards. Eddie Dombrowski's name was taken from actor Eddie Murphy, back during the beginning phases of production when Eddie was originally designed with a pleasantly optimistic personality. The name of Angela Orozco was derived from Angela Bennett, the protagonist of the film The Net, and Laura's from the novel No Language But a Cry, by author Richard D'Ambrosio. There are also indications that the layout of Silent Hill had been based on the town of San Bruno, California, to a certain extent. Reaction to the game was generally favorable. Many praised the game's graphics, especially at the time compared to other video games, which were a major improvement over the first game, with more polygons, realistic lighting and CGI, and more detailed textures, environments, and facial animation. In terms of hardware, the PlayStation 2 version has an 89 on Metacritic. The PC port, when it was initially released, received lower commendation due to some technical issues such as slow transitions, looping sounds, etc. Since its initial release, the PC version, initially intended for Windows XP, has external problems which allow use and compatibility for more modern OSs. Silent Hill 2 is ported to PS3 and Xbox 360 as part of the Silent Hill HD collection, although this version of the game has been criticized. Silent Hill 2 is often called one of the greatest works of art in the survival horror video game medium. Many players consider it to be the magnum opus of the Silent Hill series. The deep, emotional, provocative, psychological storyline, atmosphere, and music was well praised. The story touches on some mature, taboo, and controversial subjects, which was largely unheard of around 2001, although it tries to do so in a mature fashion, pushing the bar for survival horror, as well as storytelling and art direction in video gaming. For example, James's and Mary's story covers grief, relationship issues, fatal illnesses, euthanasia, the right to die, and the morality of finding another partner when one's current lover has died, and the two of them may not have properly discussed this what-if scenario. Angela's story has elements of alcoholism due to her father, sexual and physical abuse, domestic violence, rape, incest, suicide, and trauma. Eddie's story focuses on bullying, body image, and fat shaming. Some of the more universal themes include murder, revenge, loneliness, pain and suffering, existentialism, guilt, death, depression, mental illness, and mental health. Although there is some cultism and religion mentioned in the game, there is a much lesser focus on it compared to the first. Although Silent Hill 2 was praised, it received some criticism. Many fans of the first game wanted to learn more about what happened to Harry, Sybil, the baby, and the cult, but were disappointed that Silent Hill 2 generally avoids this, resulting in future Silent Hill games rectifying this. The scale of the outdoors of the town is smaller compared to the first game, with only one district instead of 3 like the first. Some of the monsters were criticized for being recycled a lot, especially the lying figures and mannequins, and some players missed the tension of being chased by the groaners and air screamers. Although Pyramid Head was praised and found terrifying by many players, he would receive popularity enough to become the series mascot as a sort, something Ida regretted. Others found his helmet head design was silly, and that he did not chase James enough. Some players felt that the game's fear factor was a step down, with a less visceral overworld and less jump scares. Critics noted that the game was a bit of a slow start, with a long walk into the town, and many players did not enjoy the apartment building complex as the first major level, with some even calling it boring. Moria's AI has been criticized a bit, as she would sometimes walk in the path of James's gun when fighting enemies, or not move to safety fast enough, resulting in her taking damage. She also does not help in battles despite that James has multiple weapons, playing into common tropes of women being helpless and needing protection in video games, which would change with another Silent Hill game created by Team Silent. That's Silent Hill 3. Additionally, it is not possible to heal Maria, and if she took too much damage in the hospital level, she could die in a few hits, causing frustration and save reloads. Like many Silent Hill games, the camera control received some criticism for not showing the player what they wanted to see, and sometimes flailing around awkwardly. Many players found the game's difficulty to be too easy, with some entering the final battle with over 20 health drinks. Because of this, many players recommend experienced survival horror players to play the game on hard. The voice acting has had mixed reception. Mary, or Maria, was considered by many players to be the standout, especially the reading of Mary's letter. James and Angela received some criticism, although their defenders point out that the characters were meant to sound like average people, feeling their sometimes stilted and awkward deliveries enhanced their personalities, adding to the surreal atmosphere. IGN pointed out that the lip sync in their review, the mouths of the characters don't always perfectly match with the words being spoken. The game's plot revealed that James murdered Mary, but forgot about it, which was seen as a shocking plot twist at the time. Although it has been pointed out by some players, the odd nature of James's increasing delusions and psychological repression of forgetting this, even putting her body in his car. This has left players to wonder if James was drunk at the time, as it is revealed in-game that James would drink a fair bit. Eddie's portrayal is also criticized because it plays into stereotypes that overweight people are gluttonous, lazy, and selfish, as he is seen eating a whole pizza, and not caring that an 8-year-old is wandering a town full of monsters. Even when James asks that Eddie leave his pizza to chase Laura, Eddie decides to remain. Some players felt his death was rushed, preferring the game's novelization approach, which features a more intimate moment between James and Eddie, where Eddie comes back to his senses and the two are able to share a final talk, much like the talk between James and Angela. How about some trivia? For the game's booth during E3 2001, a mannequin of James and Laura on top of a wall was displayed. According to Ito, the events of Silent Hill 2 are set in the late 70s or 80s, prior to the 90s, but this was retconned in subsequent installments, with Alex Shepard's diary from Silent Hill Homecoming establishing it as being set directly in the 90s. A November calendar in Amy's room shows the Wednesday is on the 7th. Maria remarks it's 10 years old. If one coincides this with Ito saying the 70s or 80s, this means the original intent could be for the game to be set in 1983 or 89. If one takes the retcon into consideration, then it means the game could now be canonically set in 94. According to Ito, the team chose to make James forgetful of his crime and gradually remembers the game progresses, so that the player could explore the abandoned city with James's mind. The concept of denial and selective memory loss would again be used for Heather Mason, Travis Grady, and Alex Shepard. The streets and buildings were inspired and named after real writers, stores, and locations. Angela Rusco appears on the North American game cover. Akira Yamaoka took recordings of over 100 footsteps for the game. In making of Silent Hill 2, he states that this was to add variety and to avoid redundancy. He also claims that silence is a sound all its own, and that the footsteps were meant to contribute to the eerie lack of music. Many ambient sounds in the game are random, meaning the sound design tends to be different every playthrough. For example, there are random chances of the player hearing footsteps, whispering, glass shattering, breathing, crying, screaming, and a pig squealing. Like Silent Hill 2 had some things changed or edited due to graphic violence and or nausea-inducing scenes in-game. For example, James's original attacks included dismembering limbs of the monsters, but it was changed to melee and ranged weapons attack without the additional violence. Eddie's original vomiting scene was much more intense, both graphically and audibly. The second part of the videotape viewed in the hotel originally had audio accompanying it. However, it was left out in the final cut of the game. When James talks to Maria through the cell bars, the scene is intentionally shot in a way that makes it look like James is also inside a cell. Although Silent Hill 2 isn't a direct sequel to the first game, there are several references to it, including the mention of Old Silent Hill, a notepad similar in appearance to the save point for Harry. Harry has a cameo in the game's UFO ending, and Lakeside Amusement Park is also referenced. In the town of Silent Hill, southeast to Rosewater Park, there is a building entitled St. Stella Church, named after the Catholic Saint Stella. It comes from the Latin name Stella Maris, which translates to Star of the Sea, and is part of the title Our Lady Star of the Sea, which happens to be the ancient title of the revered Virgin Mary. This could easily be a connection to Mary Shepherd Sunderland. Many of the facial animations in the game are not motion captured and are manually animated. Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment was one of the inspirations for the story. Konami lost the source code to Silent Hill 2, which is one reason why the HD collection had many technical issues, as the only source code available was an unfinished beta version. A patch slot adaptation of the game was released in 2015. Fans were unhappy, finding it disrespectful. The speeding limit signs in South Vale are in kilometers, although the game takes place in the United States. Silent Hill 2 had less monsters than the original game. According to Ito, this was an intentional decision, because he did not believe that James Sunderland's story arc needed as many monsters as Alessa's. He later regretted including even 9 monsters, because he felt that it would have been better to only have 5 or 6. A trailer of the game was featured in the Japanese version of the PlayStation 2 version of Shadow of Memories. Now for the remake. It was developed by Bloober Team, and it's a retelling of the same game from 2001, but reinterpreted with a new script, new story threads, and alternate endings, and reworked puzzles and gameplay. It's the first major installment since Silent Hill Downpour. If you've played the original, you would know that the Silent Hill remake is pretty different from the original. It features a distinct combat system and camera perspective than Silent Hill 2 does. It makes use of the adaptive triggers and haptic feedback of the DualSense 5 controller, and the player can explore the entirety of the town without loading screens. What about the production of the game itself? We still would like to make meaningful games. We still would like to keep our DNA to tell stories about things which are important to us. However, not by environmental storytelling, but by full action, to have much more mass appeal. And I think that this is the reason why we have chosen Silent Hill. from Bloober Team's CEO. Despite interest in the Silent Hill franchise within Konami, it remained dormant for years due to internal disagreement on what direction it should take. Motoya Komodo, who left Entersphere in 2018, subsequently joined the company and became the series producer in 2019. The film Return to Silent Hill, developed by Christoph Gans, ultimately served as the catalyst for Konami's decision to revitalize the brand. Many independent and third-party horror games had taken inspiration from Silent Hill during its absence. Konami's staff, including Okamoto, felt they needed to reaffirm the core identity of the series in order to stand apart from other titles. They concluded that what makes Silent Hill unique is how it embodies true psychological horror, and chose to reboot Silent Hill 2 for that reason. Some of the staff disagreed with this decision and lobbied to remake the first installment instead, which had been previously reimagined as Shattered Memories. Bloober Team was among the studios influenced by Silent Hill 2 and PT, which impacted games such as Layers of Fear and The Medium. Their catalog of psychological horror games and past collaboration with series composer Akira Yamaoka opened the door for long-term conversations with Konami, which took place both in Japan and Bloober Team's native Poland. Bloober Team started pitching Silent Hill games to them in 2015, but were turned down on their trips to Japan over the next 3 years. Konami invited them to another meeting around 2019, alongside several competing studios, in which they were asked to create a pitch demo for its Silent Hill 2 remake. Out of the studios, their proposal was ultimately chosen and greenlit. Instead of remaking Silent Hill 2 faithfully, the team decided that they wanted to recreate their perfect memory of it. According to Piotr Bebiano, this also gave them the opportunity to do certain things differently and smuggle in some visions of ours. Within the first few months of development, the team replayed Silent Hill 2 to gather as much information as they could and looked to the internet to gauge fan criticism. They found that the plot and world building were the most widely praised elements of the game. Other aspects, such as the AI, indoor levels, and combat system were more controversial, which they sought to reimagine. The pre-existing story was adapted into their game, with changes to the scripts, dialogue, new subplots, and alternate endings implemented to bring it over to their vision. The game was created using Unreal Engine 5, whereas Silent Hill 2 used a combination of static camera angles and third-person perspective to reflect the mental state of its protagonist. Bloober Team opted for an over-the-shoulder perspective, which they felt was more immersive and would appeal to a wider audience. In 2021, they hired a combat programmer, making their first horror title to include combat mechanics. After consulting Masahiro Ito, the core developer of the original games, it was decided that James Sunderland would be older than his traditional counterpart, who was 29. They wanted to depict a mature and weary iteration of the character, who had suffered more over his life experiences, and emphasized that this was a new iteration of the story. The combat was designed by Giacomo Vaccari, with oversight from Ito. Since the game includes both melee and ranged weapons, Vaccari aimed to depict realistic movements with each attack. For the lying figure enemy, it was not enough to create additive movement for the weapon collisions. The creature needed to move in a way that made sense for its shape and body type. Although he preferred to lean towards tension than action, the type of camera controls meant that the game became more action-oriented than previous installments. It led to more variation in enemy types, attack types, and encounters. On April 19, 2024, the icon on the Steam page was updated with changes to James's facial design. If you kept up to date with the game, you would know this was a pretty big moment. Ito provided Bloober Team with the creature designs and concept art for some of the in-game locations. It was decided early in production that the game would reinterpret existing monsters from Silent Hill 2, rather than designing new ones. Ito's concept art for Pyramid Head was based on his sketches for a statue he supervised for Gecko Corp. The Bubblehead nurse was given colored stockings because he thought the original exposed too much flesh, and because of a gameplay design. Longtime series composer Akira Yamaoka provided the musical score alongside Bloober Team's Arkadiusz Rakowski, whom he had worked on with The Medium. Yamaoka challenged himself to create a new style that would have the same impact as his original soundtrack. His goal was to maintain the parts of the score that resonated with players, while heightening those feelings in a modern format. He contributed to the sound design, which makes use of a three-dimensional audio system, allowing players to pinpoint the direction of in-game noises. Ito and Yamaoka played an active role in the game's development. According to lead producer Masi Glom, they were consulted through the creative process and provided much-needed explanations for some of Silent Hill 2's dialogue and innuendos. Ito was responsible for the combat aspect of the game. A new combat system meant changing the way certain monsters move and behave, which influenced the designs. Silent Hill 2 Remake received generally favorable reviews according to Metacritic, with a score of 87. In June 2022, Christoph Gans told a French publication that Konami was planning to launch a Silent Hill multimedia initiative and felt galvanized by the success of Capcom's Resident Evil reboots. In October 2022, Bloober Team's Silent Hill 2 was announced in a live stream hosted by Konami, alongside Townfall, Ascension, and F. God damn, has it really been 2 years already? It was confirmed to be in the final stages of development and a timed exclusive on PlayStation 5 and PC because of a marketing deal with Sony. Since Return to Silent Hill and Bloober Team's game both adapt Silent Hill 2, the producers hope to create brand synergy that would lead to a theatrical buy-in from the gaming community. In June 2024, the latter was listed by Sony among PlayStation titles releasing in 2024. Silent Hill 2 is intended to launch the next phase of Bloober Team's company initiative, Bloober Team 3.0, which will then transition them away from environmental storytelling and psychological horror into action-oriented projects with intricate gameplay and mass-market appeal. Bloober Team CEO explained, "We want to be in the same place as Naughty Dog or Bungie in 5 years, but without their problems." And if you've been keeping up with Naughty Dog or Bungie, you would know they definitely do have their share of problems. In May 2022, Babiano stated that Bloober Team would not develop licensed games for other companies unless they can tell an original story with creative freedom. I would say that it's hard to work with someone who owns an IP you're working on, but we were always talking with those licensors saying, guys, we would like to use your license, but we would like to tell our own story. If we are not able to tell our own story, if we will not have creative freedom, it doesn't make sense because Bloober Team will not make a great game. If you're in a prison, you will not be able to fly. When asked if Bloober Team would work on another Silent Hill title after this one, he responded, "I'm not going to say never." The trailer showed James to be more emotionally volatile than his traditional counterpart, including shots of him crying, screaming, pounding his fists, and beating the monsters in anger. This led to a misconception among newcomers that he was emotionless in the original. Because of technical limitations, it was not intended to be characterized that way. Takayashi Sato debunks the technical limitations myth in a 2001 interview. In October 22, Masahiro Ito stated on Twitter that he worried about the lack of subtlety in James's facial expressions. James's dissociation from reality and trauma repression were a prominent plot point in the original. Despite having a different temperament than his Bloober Team counterpart, James did express emotions. Motoya Okamoto added, "Though the trailer does go out of its way to feature many bombastic scenes, the game as a whole is also full of moments with more subtle performances." The announcement trailer for the game drew some criticism because of a fan theory that James looks at the player in the opening scene of the original. This was debunked by Ito. What about some trivia? Silent Hill 2 is the second remake of a previous installment, following the release of Shattered Memories in 2009. A more faithful remake was planned by Climax Studios at one point, but evolved into Silent Hill Origins. It is the second game in the series to release on Steam following Homecoming. Ito's redesign of the Bubblehead Nurse is similar to the design he painted for a Gecko Corp statue in 2013, which depicted it in red boots. Despite the similarity, he clarified that they are distinct designs. I painted a few concept arts for the Bubblehead Nurse in Silent Hill 2 Remake, which was a little bit different from the original. When designing the monsters in the original game, he took inspiration from bondage fashion or pictures of women in stockings. Many of his characters since then have worn colored boots or stockings. The outline of James's wedding ring is visible on his finger. Bloober Team's Silent Hill 2 is one of the first games in the series to be dubbed in Japanese. Ito was initially against the idea of a remake, stating in January 2019, "In my opinion, how do the creators remake Silent Hill 2? It's more important than graphic quality. Also, it will need some challenges to express something beyond what people expect. Don't get me wrong, that's the thing I don't want." Ito was satisfied with Bloober Team's graphics and atmosphere, adding, "We had strong demands about the motif of fog when first starting on this remake, and they were sure to depict it just as we wanted." He clarified that he did not model the creatures or build the in-game assets himself. Series co-creator Kichiro Toyama opined that remaking Silent Hill would be more difficult than other video games, stating, "It's not an action game where you can just redefine the action as in Biohazard. To bring Silent Hill up to current standards or to polish up the graphics, the fans wouldn't be satisfied. That's not what it was about, how beautiful it was. I think you'd have to rethink the concept to make it interesting to fans." Toyama complimented Bloober Team's work on the medium, which he described as a stimulating experience that played homage to other developers of the horror genre. Director of Origins and Shattered Memories believed that Silent Hill remakes would be difficult to pull off and referred to Bloober Team's Silent Hill 2 as a poison chalice, stating good luck to them because I don't know how you can do that without upsetting people. What do people have to say? Some believe that the remake is actually better than the original in some aspects. Honestly, I feel like I do have to agree with this comment that the combat in the remake is probably the best so far. Because before this, you've just had to deal with tank controls, and it's just been a mess. It's not to say that it's not, you can't get used to it, but I mean, This just feels more fluid, more just better, really. And others seem to say that the old one is actually better. I think I'd have to agree with this. The little differences will be enough to for some to prefer the original versus the remake. The little things are definitely the most important thing. And this isn't the original studio. However, well, they did make the game. Overall, I guess I could just say that it's really up to you. What you prefer, what style, the graphical fidelity, the feel itself, the tone, the voice acting, the gameplay itself, the combat, the everything, I guess.